The heat came through the windows in sheets. The kind of dry, flat heat that makes a highway diner feel like the last place on earth, which on a Tuesday morning at 7 a.m., it nearly was. Annie Butler was behind the counter wiping down the ketchup bottles when the door opened. She didn't look up right away. The bell above the door rang 40 times a shift, and she'd stopped hearing it years ago. She finished the bottle in her hand, set it in line with the others, and reached for the next one. That's when she noticed the quiet. Not the normal quiet of a slow morning. The other kind. The kind where a room full of people all stop breathing at the same time. She looked up. The man in the black ski mask had the gun already raised. Arm extended, grip tight, barrel moving in a small anxious circle like he was drawing the letter O in the air and couldn't quite close it. The couple in the far booth had already dropped. She could hear one of them whimpering against the linoleum. The trucker at the end of the counter had his hands up so fast he'd knocked his plate to the floor, eggs sliding off the edge in slow motion. The other waitress, Bev, was simply gone. There 1 second, through the kitchen door the next, like she'd never existed. Annie set down the ketchup bottle. She placed both hands flat on the counter, looked at the gun, and then looked past it, at the man holding it. At the 2 new sneakers. At the way his weight kept shifting heel to toe like he was considering running. At the slight tremor in his elbow that told her the arm had been up too long and was starting to hurt. She'd seen worse. She'd been worse. "Put it down," she said. Not loud. Not scared. The same voice she used on the last table of the night when they tried to walk out on a check. Flat. Final. Already tired of the conversation. "You've been standing outside this door for 15 minutes and you picked a Tuesday. There's maybe $180 in that register. Go home." The gunman blinked behind the mask. He hadn't expected words. At the far end of the counter, the spot by the window that caught the morning glare, the one Annie always left open because no one ever wanted it, a man in a black suit sat completely still. Not stiff. Not braced. Still. Like something that had simply stopped. His coffee sat untouched in front of him. His hands, resting on the counter, were covered in ink from the wrist up, black lines running beneath the cuffs of a suit jacket that cost more than Annie made in a month. He hadn't moved at the sound of the door. He hadn't moved at the screaming. He hadn't moved when the trucker's plate shattered on the floor. But when Annie spoke, when that voice came out of her, low and certain and completely unbothered, Joo Hyun-Suk's hands went still in a different way. The way hands go still when the body has stopped receiving instructions from the brain, because the brain has gone somewhere else entirely. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped once beneath his eye. He looked at Annie Butler the way a man looks at something he stopped believing existed, with a kind of stunned, private devastation that had no business being on a face like his. That voice. He knew that voice. He had been carrying it for 5 years in the place behind his sternum, where he kept the things he didn't talk about. He'd heard it once, on a night when the rain was coming sideways off the river and he was standing somewhere he should not have been standing, and a woman he couldn't see clearly in the dark had sat down nearby and said, "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to say a word. I'll just be here." He told himself, after, that he'd imagined it. That grief and betrayal and 3 days without sleep had manufactured a stranger's kindness out of ambient noise and river wind. He had not imagined it. The robber's arm was dropping. Whatever Annie said to him next, something quiet, something Hyun-Suk couldn't fully hear from where he sat, it landed like a hand on the shoulder. The man backed toward the door. He pushed through it. He was gone. Sirens, somewhere. The couple in the booth, exhaling. The trucker lowered his hands and stared at the floor. Annie pulled the rag from her apron and wiped down the section of counter where someone had spilled. She picked up the coffee pot. She walked the length of the counter and topped off the trucker's mug without asking. She set the pot back on the burner and clicked her pen open and looked toward the next table. Like it was weather. Like it had passed through and taken nothing with it. Hyun-Suk stood. He left 4 folded bills on the counter, enough to cover his tab 10 times over, and walked to the door without looking at her. Without speaking. Without crossing the space between them. He sat in the back of his car for a long time after, the engine running, the air conditioning filling the silence. His driver watched him in the rearview mirror and said nothing. In 12 years, the driver had learned that the times Hyun-Suk went quiet were not the times to speak. Outside, through the diner's plate glass windows, he could see Annie Butler moving behind the counter. Refilling. Wiping. existing at a frequency the rest of the room couldn't quite reach. 5 years. He had found her. Where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm sending you all the hugs. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit the like and subscribe button because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's see what happens next. Annie's phone was still face down on the nightstand when she woke up. She'd put it that way before bed out of habit. Craig had cured her years ago of sleeping with it face up, of being the kind of person who needed to know the second something happened. She'd unlearned a lot of things because of Craig. That one, at least, had stuck. She flipped it over at 6:48 a.m. and stared at the screen for a moment without moving. 47 missed calls. The notification count on her texts had given up trying to display a number and replaced it with a small, defeated. Her Venmo had transactions from names she didn't recognize. $5, $20, one for $200 from someone whose username was just a string of exclamation points. Her face was in every thumbnail. Her name, spelled wrong in half of them, was in every headline. She set the phone back down, face up this time, and went to make coffee. The voicemail from her manager, Dennis, came in at 11:43 the previous night. She played it while the coffee brewed, his voice doing the particular thing it did when he was uncomfortable, speeding up through the hard parts, slowing down on the words he'd clearly rehearsed. Media attention, not the image we're trying to project. Take a few days, we'll be in touch. She deleted it before he finished the sentence she could already hear coming. She knew what "will be in touch" meant. Dennis had never once been in touch about anything that wasn't a schedule change or a complaint. She poured her coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and pulled up 3 job listing sites and started going through them the way she went through everything, methodically, without drama, one line at a time. Craig's text came in at 9:15. Saw you on the news. You good? She read it once. She closed the notification. She went back to the job listings. The video had 7.2 million views by the time Joo Hyun-Suk's assistant pulled it up on the conference room screen at 8 a.m. He watched it once without speaking. Then he told the room to clear out. Then he watched it again. He watched it 17 times in total. Not looking for something he'd missed. He knew what was in it. He watched it the way you watch a thing when you're trying to convince yourself it's real, each time hoping the evidence will settle somewhere inside you and stay. The footage was shaky, shot from below a table at a bad angle by someone who'd had the presence of mind to record and the good sense not to get up. The audio was thin. Half the words were buried under the ambient noise of the fluorescent lights and the rain against the windows. But her voice cut through all of it, low, unhurried, carrying the particular weight that voices only get after they've absorbed more than their share. She didn't raise her hands. He noticed that first. Every other person in the frame had their hands up or their heads down or both. Annie Butler sat with her palms flat on the counter and her spine straight and her eyes fixed on the man holding a gun like he was a problem she was already bored of solving. On the 14th viewing, Hyun-Suk paused it on her face, the exact moment after she spoke, when the gunman's arm began to drop. Her expression didn't change. No relief. No satisfaction. Just the same flat, settled calm she'd carried through the whole thing, like a woman who had decided a long time ago that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford and had simply stopped budgeting for it. He looked at that face for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and told his assistant to find out everything. 5 years earlier, Joo Hyun-Suk stood on the Mercer Street Bridge at 11:40 on a Wednesday night and felt nothing. That was the part he hadn't expected. He'd anticipated anger, maybe. Or grief. The clean, recognizable kind that moves through a person in stages he'd read about once in a waiting room magazine. What he got instead was nothing. A vast, pressurized absence where everything used to be. Like a room after the furniture's been cleared out. Same walls, same floor, same dimensions, just nothing left inside worth staying for. His father had been dead for 3 days. He hadn't cried at the hospital. He hadn't cried at the arrangements, at the calls, at the quiet parade of men from the organization who came to the apartment with their heads bowed and their hands folded and their mouths full of the particular condolences that people offer when they're also relieved. He hadn't cried when, 26 hours after the funeral, his father's second-in-command sat across from him in a back office and laid out, document by document, the architecture of a betrayal so thorough and so long-running that Hyun-Suk understood, sitting there, that the last 15 years of his life had been built on a blueprint someone else had drawn. Every sacrifice. Every compromise. Everything he'd done in the name of loyalty to a man and a structure he believed in. All of it constructed to serve someone else's plan. All of it built on the assumption that Hyun-Suk would keep his head down and keep working and never look too closely at the foundation. He hadn't cried then either. He was not crying now, standing on the bridge railing with the rain coming sideways off the river and his suit jacket soaked through to the shirt. He wasn't thinking in sentences. He was just standing there, looking at the water, doing the math that a person does when they are trying to determine whether the weight of continuing outpaces the weight of not. He didn't hear her sit down. She was just suddenly there, not on the railing, on the concrete ledge beside it, close enough that he was aware of her presence but far enough that it didn't feel like an intervention. She didn't grab his arm. She didn't gasp. She didn't pull out a phone. She just sat, with her elbows on her knees and her eyes on the river, like she'd come to the bridge for the same reason people go to rivers, to look at something that keeps moving when everything else has stopped. A full minute passed. Maybe two. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Her voice was low. Not soft exactly. There was something too certain in it for soft. Settled was the word, though he wouldn't find it until later. "You don't have to talk. I'll just be here." He didn't answer. He didn't tell her to leave. Some part of him, the part that was still doing the math, registered her presence the way a drowning person registers a handhold. Not grabbed yet. Just noted. She didn't fill the silence. That was the thing he would carry afterward, the detail that would surface in the years between that bridge and this city. She had let the silence be what it was. She hadn't tried to fix it or talk around it or smooth it into something more manageable. She just sat in it with him, patient and steady, like a woman who understood that some kinds of darkness needed company more than they needed light. The rain slowed, then stopped. He never saw her face clearly. The bridge lights were behind her and the dark was between them, and he wasn't, at any point, looking at faces. He was only ever aware of her voice, that low, unhurried, unfrightened voice, and the simple physics of another person choosing to remain. By the time the clouds broke, something in the math had changed. He stepped down from the railing. He didn't look back. He never learned her name. The third job listing she applied to that morning asked for a cover letter. Annie stared at the blank document for a while, then closed the laptop and sat with her coffee going cold and thought, not for the first time, about the woman she'd have to pretend to be to write one. Enthusiastic. Forward-facing. Eager to contribute. She hadn't always had to pretend. 5 years ago, Annie Butler laughed easily. That was the thing nobody who knew her now would have guessed, that there had been a version of her who laughed at small things, who called her friends back the same day, who had opinions about things that didn't matter and shared them without calculating the cost first. She'd been 24 and working lunch shifts and taking a night class in hospitality management because she'd had a plan, a loose and optimistic one, but a plan. She'd believed in the plan. She'd believed in a lot of things. She'd believed in Craig. Craig was not a man who announced himself as dangerous. That was the part she'd spent a long time trying to explain to people who hadn't been there. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man who remembered what you'd said 3 weeks ago and brought it back at exactly the right moment to show you he'd been listening. He made her feel, in the beginning, like someone worth paying close attention to. What she didn't understand then was that close attention can be a form of surveillance. He started with small things. A comment about a friend. "She doesn't really have your back, you know that, right?" Delivered so gently, so reasonably, that it didn't feel like a wedge being driven. It felt like a concern. He questioned her memory of conversations, her read on situations, her instincts about people, always with that measured, patient tone that implied he was the reasonable one and she was operating from emotion. He didn't take her friendship. He made her doubt them until she let them go herself. He didn't silence her humor. He responded to it so flatly, so many times, that she stopped offering it. By the time she understood what had happened to her, she was living in an apartment that felt like his, working shifts she had to clear with him, and had not called anyone just to talk in nearly 8 months. She left on a Tuesday. One bag, the things that were hers before him. She didn't tell him she was going. She'd learned by then that announcing exits gave him time to close the doors. She had nowhere to go that night. Her sister's place was across the city and it was late and she couldn't explain, not yet, not in words that would make sense to someone who hadn't been inside it. So she walked. She walked until she hit the river, and then she sat on a bench near the Mercer Street Bridge and watched the rain hit the water. She wasn't on the railing. She never got close to the railing. But she understood, sitting there, why people did. Not because they wanted to stop existing, or maybe not only that, but because the weight of having been slowly, methodically made smaller gets to a point where the body wants to put it down. Just set it down somewhere and walk away without it. She sat on that bench for a long time. At some point she became aware of a man standing on the bridge nearby, very still in the rain, and something in the quality of his stillness made her talk, not to him specifically, just out loud into the dark, the way you talk when you need to hear that a human voice is still capable of sounding like itself. She never saw his face clearly. She didn't need to. She just needed to keep talking until the rain stopped. She never knew he was listening, like it was the only thing keeping him on the bridge. By Thursday, the media requests had their own folder. Annie had created it without thinking, the same way she organized everything, efficiently without sentiment, and then stared at the folder name she typed, ignore, and left it. A producer from a morning show called twice and left a voicemail the second time, her voice carrying the particular brightness of someone who believes they are offering a gift. Incredible story. Authentic moment. Millions of people moved by your composure. Annie listened to 40 seconds of it and deleted it. She didn't have composure. She had practice. There was a difference, and it wasn't the kind that made good television. The Venmo requests had slowed but not stopped. Someone had started a fundraiser in her name without asking. A man from Ohio left a comment on a news article proposing marriage and listing his annual income as evidence of suitability. A blogger wrote a piece titled The Unbothered Black Woman, and what she teaches us that Annie did not read past the headline because she already knew what was inside it and she was tired in advance. She applied to 11 jobs that week. 3 didn't call back. 2 called back and then went quiet after Googling her name. 1 offered her a shift position at a hotel restaurant across town, starting pay lower than what Dennis had been paying her, and she told them she'd think about it, which meant she wouldn't. Craig texted on Wednesday. Then again on Thursday morning. Then he was at her door on Friday evening, which was not a surprise. Craig had always understood that silence was a door he could walk through if he just waited long enough for her to seem rude for keeping it closed. She heard his knock and stood in her kitchen and didn't move. Annie. I know you're home. A pause. I just wanted to check on you. That's not a crime. She stood very still, the way she'd learned to stand when he was on the other side of something, door, argument, version of events, and waited. He knocked once more. Then she heard him exhale, long and pointed, the exhale designed to be heard, and then the sound of the elevator at the end of the hall. She made dinner. She didn't think about it again until she was lying in bed, and then she thought about it for 2 hours, and that was the part she hated most. Not the knock, but the 2 hours after. The man at her door Saturday morning was not Craig. He was compact and quiet in a dark jacket, and he held out a small envelope with both hands in a way that managed to be neither aggressive nor deferential, just precise. He said he'd been asked to deliver it. He left before she could ask by whom. Inside the envelope was a business card, heavy stock, minimal, just a name and a number, and a note card with 4 lines of handwriting so controlled it looked architectural. You saved my life once. I would like to offer you a job in return. No other obligation. JSH. Annie read it twice. She turned the business card over. The back was blank. She stood in her doorway for a moment, then went inside and dropped both pieces into the trash can beside her kitchen counter. She made coffee. She sat at the table and opened the laptop and went back to the job listings. 20 minutes later she got up and retrieved the card from the trash. She wiped the coffee grounds off the corner with a dish towel and looked at the handwriting again. Then she set it on the counter, went back to the table, and stared at the laptop without reading anything on the screen. That evening she dropped it in the trash again. Deliberately this time. With intention. She went to bed at 10. She retrieved it at 10:14. She put it in the kitchen drawer and didn't look at it again. For 2 days. He knocked once. Not the way Craig knocked. That particular rhythm designed to communicate patience while implying its opposite. Just one knock, clean and unhurried, and then silence. Annie looked through the peephole first. She always looked through the peephole now, another habit Craig had given her that she'd reframed as practical rather than sad. The man in the hallway was standing 2 feet back from the door, which she noticed immediately, not pressed close the way people stood when they were trying to push the space between themselves and the threshold, but back, giving her room to see him fully before she decided anything. She opened the door. He was taller than he'd seemed in the diner, or maybe that was the hallway, the low ceiling, the way he held himself, Not large exactly, but the kind of still that makes a person seem like they occupy more space than they technically do. The suit was dark, the same careful cut as before. The tattoos ran up his neck and disappeared behind his collar and reappeared across the back of his hands. His face was composed in a way that looked like it had required practice. Not blank, but controlled, all the working parts set to a frequency too low for casual reading. Annie looked at all of this in approximately 4 seconds. "I'm not interested," she said. He didn't flinch. Didn't recalibrate into a sales pitch or pull out credentials or shift his weight forward. He just stood there for a moment, absorbing her refusal the way a wall absorbs sound, completely, without sending it back. Then he said, 5 years ago. A bridge. It was raining. Annie went very still. Not the stillness she used at the diner, the practiced kind, the armor. This was different. This was the stillness of a person whose body has received information that the brain hasn't finished processing yet. She stood in her doorway and looked at him and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the specific vertigo of a thing you thought was sealed opening at an unmarked seam. He didn't press it. Didn't watch her face with the hungry attention of someone waiting to be thanked or recognized or let inside. He just said it, and let it land wherever it was going to land, and then he nodded once. Not a bow, just an acknowledgement, the closing of a sentence, and turned and walked to the elevator. He didn't look back. Annie stood in the open doorway until she heard the elevator arrive and the doors close. Then she went inside and sat at her kitchen table and did not move for a long time. She made tea she didn't drink. She stood at the window and watched the street below without seeing it. She went to the kitchen drawer and took out the card and set it on the table and looked at it the way she'd looked at the gun 2 weeks ago, without fear, but with the full weight of her attention, trying to understand what she was actually dealing with. A bridge. 5 years ago. A man she hadn't seen, only sensed. A stillness in the rain that she talked at because something in her needed to hear her own voice insisting that the world still contained people who chose to stay. She picked up the card at 11 p.m. and dialed before she could build a case against it. He answered on the second ring. No greeting, just the quality of a line being opened. Someone on the other end, present and waiting. Annie looked at the wall across from her kitchen table, the one that still had a nail in it from a picture she'd taken down 2 years ago and never replaced. "What's the job?" she said. The silence on his end lasted exactly long enough to tell her that he'd been hoping she'd call. "Something you're already good at," he said. Hazel didn't look like what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something colder, maybe, all glass and angles and the particular kind of minimalism that was really just wealth dressed down. What she found instead was warm light and dark wood and tables spaced far enough apart that conversations stayed private. A room that had been designed by someone who understood the difference between impressive and comfortable and had chosen, deliberately, to be both. The menu was handwritten on a single card. The flowers on each table were small and unfussy. The kitchen sounds were there if you listened for them but never intruded. Everything in the room was making an effort that didn't show, which Annie recognized as the hardest kind of effort to sustain. She started on a Wednesday. By Friday she knew the menu well enough to describe every dish without looking at the card. By the following Tuesday she had identified which of the regular tables needed more room between courses and adjusted without being asked, which servers were carrying too many sections without complaint, and which busser was doing the work of 2 people and being thanked for none of it. The sommelier's name was Remy. He had the specific confidence of a man whose expertise had never once been questioned by anyone he considered worth impressing, which meant he was wholly unprepared for Annie Butler. He made a comment on her third shift, gentle in phrasing, precise in its condescension, about her pronunciation of a wine region while she was mid-recommendation to a table of 4. Annie looked at him. Then she looked at the table. "He's right about the pronunciation," she said pleasantly. "He's wrong about the pairing. The tannins in that one will fight the sauce. You want something with a little more acid." She named a different bottle. The table ordered it. When it arrived and the woman at the corner seat took a sip and closed her eyes for a moment, the way people do when something exceeds what they were hoping for, Annie set Remy's glass down in front of him and moved to the next table without comment. Remy did not make another comment. At her, or in general, for the rest of the week. She told Hyun-Suk on the Thursday of her second week that his back-of-house staff was underpaid by industry standard and that he was going to lose his best line cook within 60 days if something didn't change. She said it the way she said everything, without drama, without softening, as a statement of observable fact. He looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention she was still getting used to, the kind that didn't come with an agenda attached. "I'll look into it," he said. By the following week, the line cook had received a raise. Annie noticed and said nothing. When he offered a car for late shifts, framed as standard for senior staff, which she was not yet and they both knew it, she declined without making it a discussion. She took the bus. The bus was fine. The bus was hers. He didn't offer again. She noted that too. The staff watched her the way people watch someone who has walked into a room and immediately rearranged it without touching a single piece of furniture, with fascination and something adjacent to relief. She was not warm in the performed way the hospitality industry sometimes demanded. She was something more useful than warm. She was fair, and she was consistent, and she did not have different versions of herself for different audiences, which in that environment was so rare it read almost as radical. Hyun-Suk watched her too. From the edges of rooms, from the pass-through between the kitchen and the floor, from the corner table where he sometimes worked through the dinner service with papers he rarely looked at. He told himself he was watching the way any employer watches a new hire, assessing, calibrating. He almost believed it. He hadn't named the other thing yet, the thing that happened in his chest when she said exactly what she meant and didn't wait to see how it landed. He was running out of reasons not to. He came on a Friday, which was the worst night for it. Full house, every table turned twice, the kind of service where the floor had its own momentum and any disruption to the rhythm cost everyone. Annie would think about that later, the timing, and understand that it wasn't accidental. Craig had always had an instinct for the moments when she had the least room to respond. She saw him before he saw her. He was at the host's stand, dressed well, not his best, but considered the particular calibration of a man who wanted to appear as though he hadn't thought about what he was wearing. The hostess was smiling at something he'd said. He had that effect on people in first encounters, a warmth that felt genuine because he'd had years to practice making it feel that way. He looked up and found her across the room, and his face did the thing. The specific softening, the slight widening of the eyes, the smile that arrived like an apology already pre-accepted. She had loved that face once. She had rearranged herself, over years, to deserve it. The hostess seated him in her section. Of course she did. Annie picked up her order pad and walked to the table and stood across from him and said, "Good evening. Can I start you with something to drink?" In exactly the same voice she used for every other table, which she knew would frustrate him and knew he would not let show. Annie. Just her name, said like a sigh, like relief, like he'd been looking for her, and here she was finally. "We have a nice burgundy this evening if you're interested," he ordered politely. He was charming with the food runner. He did not make a scene or linger past what the table's pace allowed. He ate well, drank moderately, and when Annie set his check down, he tucked the bills inside the folder without counting them and placed it at the table's edge. She found the note when she collected it. Written on a cocktail napkin in his handwriting, the one she'd once found reassuring in its steadiness. "You were always better than this. Come home." She pocketed it. She finished the remaining 40 minutes of her shift with the same pace and precision she'd maintained all evening. She thanked her tables. She ran her closing side work. She said good night to the hostess and to the food runner who was stacking trays by the service station. She made it to the kitchen before her hands started shaking. Not fear, she knew the shape of fear, had mapped it thoroughly enough to identify it on sight. This was different. This was the exhaustion that comes from being perceived by someone who has only ever seen the version of you they built, who carries that version around like a photograph and keeps holding it up against your face, insisting on the resemblance. It was the weight of being known wrong by someone who would never understand they were doing it. She gripped the edge of the prep counter and breathed and waited for it to pass. She didn't hear Hyun-Suk come in. She was aware of him suddenly, the way you become aware of a room's temperature, not an entrance, just a presence. He set a glass of water on the counter beside her hands. He pulled out the stool on the other side and sat down. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't fill the space with the sounds of a person trying to be useful. He just sat. Elbows on the counter, eyes forward, close enough that she wasn't alone and far enough that she wasn't crowded. The kitchen settled around them. The last of the line cooks moved through and the lights above the pass dimmed and neither of them spoke. It was, Annie thought, exactly right. He told her on a Sunday, which was the one day Haysol was closed. She'd come in to collect a jacket she'd left in the back, not expecting anyone, and found him at the corner table with coffee and papers he wasn't reading. He looked up when she came in and something in his expression settled, the way a room settles when a window is opened, not dramatic, just a small and necessary shift. He asked if she had a few minutes. She sat down. He didn't build to it. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't construct approaches or lay groundwork or test the temperature first. He simply said what he meant when he was ready to say it, and trusted the other person to receive it without scaffolding. He told her about his father. About the 3 days between the death and the discovery, and what the discovery had been, and what it had cost him in the accounting of his own life to understand that the thing he'd oriented everything around had been, in fundamental ways, a fiction. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way people describe damage they've had long enough to stop being surprised by. Then he told her about the bridge, the rain, the particular quality of the silence before she'd arrived and the particular quality of the silence after she spoke, which were not the same silence at all. He told her what he'd been considering, standing there. He said it simply and directly because she deserved the full weight of it, not a softened version that would let her receive it comfortably without understanding what it actually meant. Annie listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without letting her face perform a reaction before she'd finished processing. When he stopped talking, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." She looked at the table. Then she told him about Craig, not the whole of it, not the years of it, but enough. The piece-by-piece removal. The way her own instincts had become unreliable under the sustained pressure of someone who needed her to doubt them. The night she left and walked to the river because she had nowhere else to take the weight of it. "He never hit me," she said. "He was much more creative than that." Hyun-Suk said nothing. He didn't fill the space with anger on her behalf or the particular sympathy that sometimes felt, to Annie, indistinguishable from pity. He just received it, the way he'd received everything, steadily, without making it about himself. She looked at him directly then. "I see how you watch me," she said. "I've seen it since the first week. The way you stay at the edge of rooms. The way you don't ask questions but you notice everything." She kept her voice even. This was not an accusation. She needed it to not be an accusation, because it wasn't. "I need you to understand something. I cannot be a project. I know how to recognize when someone has decided I need to be rebuilt, and I won't do that again. Not even with careful hands." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone formulating a defense. The silence of someone who had already known this was true and was deciding whether to say so. "I know," he said. "I'm not here to fix you." He looked at her with that quality of attention she had spent weeks learning to sit with, steady, undemanding, aimed. "I'm here because you're the only person I've ever met who didn't need me to be anything." Annie looked at him for a long time. Outside, the street was quiet. The coffee between them had gone cold. Neither of them moved to do anything about it. He was leaning against the wall beside the staff exit, which told her he'd been there long enough to find a comfortable position. Not the front entrance, the back, the one she always used, the one that wasn't visible from the street. She didn't ask how he knew about it. She already understood that Craig had always done his research. He looked good. He'd always known how to look good. He straightened when he saw her and put his hands in his pockets and gave her the smile, not the wide one he'd used in the restaurant, but the smaller one, the private one, the one she'd once believed was only for her. "I just want to talk," he said. "That's all." Annie stopped a few feet from him and waited. She'd learned, in the years since, that the best way to handle Craig was to give him the floor immediately and completely. Interrupt him and he pivoted. Let him talk and eventually he arrived at the actual thing, the machinery beneath the presentation. He talked for a while. He was good at it. The sentences were well constructed, the tone calibrated perfectly between wounded and reasonable, and the argument, as always, was internally coherent if you accepted its premises. The premises were that she was someone he recognized and she was not living like it. That the woman he knew had been going somewhere and this, the restaurant, the new people, the distance she kept, was a detour, not a destination. That she was making herself smaller to fit a life that didn't fit her, and he could see it even if she couldn't, and wasn't that worth something, that he still saw her so clearly after everything. Annie listened to all of it. And somewhere in the middle of it she became aware of something quiet happening inside her, not anger, not the old familiar exhaustion, but something closer to curiosity. She was looking for the woman he was describing. Searching back through herself the way you search a drawer for something you were sure you'd kept, moving things aside, checking beneath. The woman who'd needed his particular version of seeing in order to feel visible. The woman whose instincts had become so undermined that his certainty had felt, by contrast, like solid ground. She couldn't find her. She looked, honestly and without defensiveness, and that woman was simply not there anymore. Not hiding. Not suppressed. Gone, grown out of, the way you grow out of a coat that once fit and one day doesn't, and you can't identify the exact morning it stopped. Craig was still talking. Annie waited for him to finish. "She's not here," she said when he did. He blinked. "The woman you're describing. I've been listening and I know who you mean, and she's gone." She said it without heat, without triumph. It was just true. "I'm not who I was when I was with you. I'm not trying to be. I think you should stop coming here." He opened his mouth. She recognized the shape of what was coming, the reframe, the gentle implication that this clarity was itself a symptom of something she couldn't see. She'd heard it before. It landed differently now. It landed like weather. "Good night, Craig," she said, and went back inside. 2 weeks later she found Hyun-Suk on the back steps at midnight, the door propped open behind him, a takeout container balanced on his knee. He was eating with the focused contentment of a man who had learned to take small pleasures seriously. He looked up when she came out, but didn't say anything. Annie sat down beside him on the step. Not close enough to crowd him. Close enough to be there. "Don't say anything," she said. "I'm just going to stay here for a while." She felt him go still, not tense, but still, the particular stillness of a person receiving something they recognize. When she looked over, his eyes were warm in a way she'd never seen on his face before, unguarded and unperformed, there and then his. He reached into the bag beside him and held out a pair of chopsticks. She took them. "Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. It truly means everything. If this story moved you, just wait until you see what's coming next. The next one is wilder, deeper, and more intriguing than anything you can imagine. Subscribe if you haven't yet so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one."